You unlock a heavy oak door on a narrow Florentine street just after dawn. Inside, the air smells of clove, beeswax, and crushed saffron. Jars of dried roots and colored powders line the shelves like a small, fragrant library of the human body. And for a moment, it looks exactly like the romantic image you'd expect. The wise healer quietly dispensing cures to a grateful city. Now the puncture. In 1297, a man enrolled as a member of Florence's Apothecary Guild, who wasn't a healer at all, he was a poet. His name was Dante Alighieri, and he joined the Arti dei Medici e Speziali, the Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries, for one documented reason. Guild membership was the legal price of admission to political office in Florence, and there simply wasn't a separate guild for writers. Dante never ground a single root, he just needed the membership card. That's not a trivia footnote, that's the thesis of this entire video. Here's the claim I'm going to prove. Owning a medieval apothecary shop was never really a medicine business. It was a licensing business, a luxury goods business, and a credit business that happened to sell medicine on the side. And the shops that understood that distinction got rich, while the ones that thought they were in the healing trade stayed comfortable at best, and often stayed poor. The popular image is a hunched old man grinding herbs by candlelight, filling something close to a modern prescription for the sick. That image is mostly wrong. Documented Spezieria, apothecary shop, inventories from 14th and 15th century Florence show shelves dominated by sugar, wax, imported spices, dyes, paper, and painter's pigments, not medicinal compounds. Medicine was one product line among several, and often the smallest one by revenue. Day to day, you were less a physician and more a specialty grocer who also happened to know which root brought down a fever. The healing was real, it just wasn't the business. Think about who actually walked through your door on an average Tuesday. Not a sick peasant clutching a written prescription. That model barely existed yet. More often, it was a household servant sent to buy sugar for a feast, a painter's apprentice sent to buy pigment for a fresco commission, or a priest restocking candle wax for the week's services. The sick customer, when he did arrive, was often buying the same theriac or herbal compound your other customers bought as a general tonic, without any doctor's involvement at all. Medicine in this shop wasn't a prescribed intervention. It was one more item on a shelf, purchased the way you'd purchase salt. Let's reconstruct what it actually took to open your doors, item by item, and I'll flag every figure as we go, documented, reconstructed, or illustrative. First, the guild matriculation fee. This part is documented in surviving guild statute records. Entry into the Arte dei Medici e Speziali required a matriculation payment on admission, plus recurring annual dues afterward. Florentine guild fees for the wealthier arti, the major guilds, which this one was, ran to several florins for matriculation alone, with steeper charges if you hadn't personally served the full required apprenticeship term inside the city. Treat the existence and structure of this fee as documented. Treat the precise florin amount as variable by decade, and by whether you entered as a master's son, an outsider, or a widow continuing a late husband's shop. Second, the shop lease. A ground floor commercial space on a decent street, ideally near the cathedral works, a market square, or a wool guild district with heavy foot traffic, is reconstructed here at roughly 8 to 15 florins a year, based on comparable Florentine rental patterns for artisan shops in this period. That figure is an estimate, built from adjacent trades' surviving lease records, not a surviving apothecary lease itself, and I want to be honest about that gap. Third, equipment. Bronze mortars and pestles of varying sizes, a set of scales precise enough to weigh saffron by the grain, glass and glazed ceramic jars for storage, a small copper still for distilling waters and oils, plus wooden counters, shelving, and a strongbox for coin and account books. Reconstructed total, somewhere in the range of 15 to 25 florins, for a modest but genuinely credible shop, assembled from craft guild price references for bronzework and glasswork of the period. This is illustrative, not drawn from a single surviving inventory, but the individual component prices it's built on are reasonably well attested. Fourth, and this is the line item that actually breaks the bank, opening stock. Saffron, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, sugar, theriac ingredients, and blocks of wax. A single pound of good saffron in this period could run to a florin or more on its own, since it required an enormous quantity of hand-picked crocus stigmas to produce even a modest weight. Sugar and pepper were cheaper per pound but still counted as imported luxuries with real markups attached. A credible opening inventory, reconstructed from comparable spice merchant stock records of the era, lands somewhere between 40 and 80 florins depending on how ambitious your luxury offerings were from day one. Fifth, and easy to overlook, insurance against your own ignorance, in the form of a guaranteeing master. Guild statutes in several Italian cities required a newly matriculated apothecary, particularly one entering as an outsider rather than inheriting a father's shop, to have an established master vouch for his competence and his character before the guild would grant a full license to compound and sell medicines rather than just simple goods. That vouching relationship wasn't free either. Documented patterns suggest it often came bundled with an informal debt of loyalty, sometimes formalized as a small ongoing payment, or a promise not to undercut the guarantor's prices in the same neighborhood. Call this reconstructed, drawn from guild custom rather than a specific surviving contract, but the underlying obligation shows up again and again across the record. Now the scale that actually makes all of this land. A skilled Florentine building laborer in the 14th century earned, by documented wage records preserved in the Florentine cathedral works accounts, something in the neighborhood of a few soldi a day, with 29 soldi to the florin as the standard period exchange. Run that math, and a single pound of saffron could represent 2 to 3 weeks of a skilled laborer's total wages. Your entire opening stock alone could represent a full year or more of a skilled worker's total income. Add the matriculation fee, the equipment, and the lease deposit together, and total startup capital for a credible urban shop reconstructs to somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 years of a skilled laborer's total earnings, paid up front before a single customer walks through your door. You are not opening a corner shop with pocket change. You are making a capital investment on the rough scale of buying a small parcel of urban property, and you're doing it entirely on faith that the spice trade holds steady long enough to earn it back. Who actually staffs this thing once the doors are open? There are 3 real options, and the one that looks cheapest is usually the most expensive once you run the full math. Option 1. You work the counter yourself, with your wife and older children handling weighing, bottling, and sales during the shop's busiest hours. Documented broadly across Italian artisan households of this period. Family labor cost nothing in direct wages, but everything in opportunity. Every hour your wife spends bottling rose water is an hour she isn't running household accounts, negotiating with suppliers, or managing the domestic side of what was, in merchant families, itself effectively a full-time administrative job. Option 2. You hire a journeyman, a trained apothecary who has finished his apprenticeship elsewhere but doesn't yet own a shop of his own. He costs a straightforward wage. Documented guild pay patterns suggest journeyman compensation tracked roughly with skilled artisan wages elsewhere in the city, sometimes with a small profit share layered on top if he's especially skilled and you're worried about losing him to a rival shop across the street. This is the most transparent labor cost of the 3, precisely because it's a wage you can write down. Option 3, and here's your genuinely surprising comparison, the apprentice. He looks free. He isn't. Guild apprenticeship contracts, several of which survive in Florentine and Venetian archives, obligated the master to feed, house, and clothe the boy for the full contract term, often 5 to 7 years, and to train him in the complete trade, including the valuable parts, your supplier contacts, your pricing structure, your compounding formulas, your customer relationships. Room and board for a growing teenage boy across 7 straight years, reconstructed against period food price data, can easily exceed what you'd have paid a journeyman in straight wages over the same stretch of time. And at the end of the contract, you've personally trained your future direct competitor, who now knows almost everything you know and owes you nothing further once his term ends. The free apprentice was, once you tally what he ate and what he learned, frequently the single most expensive labor arrangement on the table. Buried inside several surviving guild statutes is a clause that reads, on its face, like routine bureaucratic housekeeping. Apothecaries were required to have their compound remedies, theriac especially, the era's most prestigious and most expensive cure-all, sometimes containing dozens of separate ingredients, inspected and tested before a panel of guild physicians prior to sale. Hold on to that clause. It is going to matter a great deal later in this video, and not for the reason you'd expect from a rule that sounds like ordinary consumer protection. Your entire inventory depends on a supply chain stretching thousands of miles, and nearly every link in it can snap without warning. Saffron, at least you could source locally, Tuscany and San Gimignano especially, was a documented major European saffron producer in this period, which is a large part of why Florentine apothecaries could deal seriously in it at all, rather than treating it as a rare import. But cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, and nutmeg arrived overland and by sea from South and Southeast Asia, funneled through Levantine ports, purchased by Venetian and Genoese merchant fleets, and resold at a fresh markup at every single stage of the journey before it ever touched your shelf. Sugar came primarily from Sicily and Cyprus, still relatively rare and expensive as a sweetener rather than the cheap commodity it would later become. Wax, often sourced from the Balkans and parts of North Africa, mattered as much for church candles as it did for medicinal ointments and sealing. Here's what's genuinely fragile about all of it. Every link in that chain runs through a port city, a mountain pass, or a merchant fleet that war, piracy, or plague can interrupt without notice. When Genoa and Venice went to war with each other, which they did, repeatedly, across this period, spice prices in Florence could spike almost overnight, and you'd be sitting on a shop full of stock priced at yesterday's cost, watching customers refuse to pay tomorrow's asking price. There is no insurance policy for a naval blockade in the 14th century. There is only your own cash reserve, and hoping it's deep enough. There's a second, quieter fragility layered underneath the first, quality you can't verify yourself. You are not the one growing pepper in Malabar or harvesting nutmeg in the Banda Islands. You are buying from a Venetian merchant, who bought from an Alexandrian intermediary, who bought from someone further along a chain you will never see and can never audit. Weight could be shorted. Cheaper barks and roots could be mixed into a barrel of the real thing before it ever reached Italian soil, reconstructed from the broader pattern of medieval long-distance trade disputes. Adulteration and short waiting happened somewhere along these chains often enough that established Florentine merchants developed reputational networks, trusted counterparties they returned to again and again, specifically to manage a risk no contract alone could fully solve. Trust, in other words, was itself a supply chain input, every bit as necessary as the saffron. Let's build your income from the smallest, most obvious stream, up to the largest, least expected one, because the order genuinely surprises people who assume medicine paid the bills. Smallest, basic herbal remedies sold to ordinary neighborhood customers. Thin margins, modest volume, mostly useful for keeping local goodwill and a steady rotating base of repeat foot traffic through your door. Next up, candles and soap, sold in real volume to households and critically to churches, which needed wax candles constantly, reliably, and in bulk for every service and feast day on the calendar. Steady, unglamorous, dependable in a way medicine rarely was. Next, dyes and pigments. This is where the picture gets genuinely interesting. Florentine apothecaries supplied the pigments used by painters, because the same imported minerals and plant extracts used in medicine were also the raw materials of paint. Documented guild membership roles from this period include painters as an affiliated subcategory of the Arte dei Medici e Speziali, precisely because painters bought their raw materials from shops exactly like yours. Botticelli's guild was on paper the same guild as your spice shop. Above that, luxury confections and spices sold to elite households, sugared almonds and spiced wine for a merchant wedding, saffron for an important feast dish, the kind of large single order a noble family placed once, rarely, and paid handsomely for without haggling. And the largest, least expected revenue source of all, credit. Established apothecaries because they dealt constantly with wealthy repeat households and already kept detailed account books as a matter of course, frequently ended up extending credit, functioning effectively as small-scale bankers to their regular customers, carrying balances forward month to month, recovering an implicit interest cost through their pricing, and building the long-term financial relationships that outlasted any single sale of pepper or rosewater by years. The account book, not the mortar and pestle, was the real engine driving the most profitable shops in the city. Notice what this ladder actually shows you when you step back from it. The bottom three rungs, remedies, candles, dyes, are all things a customer walks in and buys once. The top two rungs, luxury orders and credit, are relationships, not transactions, and relationships compound in a way that single sales never can. A shop that only ever climbed the first three rungs was, structurally capped. A shop that reached the top two had built something closer to a standing financial institution wearing an apothecary's sign. Here are two shops, same trade, same guild, wildly different financial outcomes. Shop A, a small-town spezzeria in a rural Tuscan hill town. It sells mostly herbal remedies to local farmers and their families, transacted in cash, in small quantities, with no meaningful pigment trade, no wedding confections, and no credit book to speak of. Thin margins on thin volume, month after month. This shop provides a stable, modest, subsistence-level living, comparable, reconstructed against period cost of living data, to perhaps 2 or 3 times a skilled laborer's annual wage. Respectable work, never wealth. Shop B, an urban Florentine speziaria, positioned near the cathedral works and the Wool Guild district, in the middle of the money. It sells the same base herbal remedies as Shop A, but layers on top of that the pigment trade to painters, luxury spice orders for merchant weddings, standing wax supply contracts with churches, and, critically, extends credit to its wealthiest repeat customers. Reconstructed annual income here can run 5 to 10 times that of Shop A, and the owner, across a couple of decades, moves from renting his shop to owning the building outright, then acquiring additional property, and eventually into eligibility for minor political office, exactly the mechanism guild membership was designed to permit in the first place. Same trade, same guild, nearly identical starting equipment and training. The entire difference between these two outcomes is which revenue streams you built on top of the herbal remedies, and whether you treated the account book as central to the business or merely incidental to it. It's worth being honest about why Shop A rarely became Shop B, even when the owner wanted it to. Location mattered enormously. A Hilltown spizzeria simply didn't sit near enough painters, wool merchants, or noble households to build the upper rungs of the revenue ladder, no matter how ambitious its owner was. Capital mattered too. Climbing toward Shop B's model required enough spare cash to extend credit in the first place, and a shop already running thin margins rarely had that cushion to spare. The two shops weren't separated by effort. They were separated by geography and by the capital reserve needed to take the next step up. Now back to that inspection clause, the one requiring compound remedies like theriac to pass a guild panel before sale. Here's why it mattered, and it isn't the reason you'd guess. That clause wasn't primarily a consumer protection measure, though it certainly functioned as one on paper. It was a barrier to entry. Established, well-connected master apothecaries were the ones who sat on those inspection panels. A small or new shop's theriac batch could face far more scrutiny and far more delay than an established master's nearly identical batch, and surviving guild fraud prosecutions from this period disproportionately targeted smaller, newer operators rather than incumbent masters. The same guild structure that let Shop B climb toward political relevance also protected Shop B from Shop A ever meaningfully catching up. The inspection clause is the actual mechanism behind the contrast you just watched play out. It wasn't neutral machinery sitting quietly in the background. It was never designed to be. If that kind of built-in structural advantage, a rule that looks like safety and functions like a moat, is the part of history that actually grabs you, that's exactly the angle this channel digs into every single week. Subscribe if you want more of these hidden mechanisms taken apart piece by piece. 4 risks here, and each one is either documented or clearly labeled as illustrative rather than dressed up as fact. First, documented. The Black Death, arriving in Florence in 1348, killed a substantial share of the city's population within a matter of months and devastated guild membership rolls across every trade, apothecaries fully included. Strangely, surviving apothecaries in the plague's immediate aftermath sometimes saw demand for remedies spike sharply even as their own customer base was simultaneously collapsing around them, a genuinely strange, whiplash position to run a business from. Second, illustrative, but grounded firmly in documented guild fraud statutes, adulteration prosecutions. Cutting expensive saffron with cheaper dyed substitutes, or stretching costly theriac with filler, was a known and specifically punishable offense in guild records, and a single conviction could mean fines, confiscation of stock, or outright loss of your license to trade. Your entire capital investment gone, over one dishonest or desperate batch. Third, documented as a recurring pattern across the period even if not tied to one single dramatic event, currency debasement. As Florentine and other Italian mints periodically adjusted the silver content of smaller circulating coinage, a shop holding working capital in soldi rather than gold florins could watch that capital quietly lose real purchasing power between one trading season and the next, with no dramatic headline moment to warn you it was happening. Fourth, illustrative, bad debt from noble credit customers. You just learned the credit book was your single biggest revenue source. It was also your single biggest exposure. A noble household that ran up a substantial balance and then simply declined, or was chronically slow to settle it left you as an unsecured creditor with essentially no real leverage against someone far more powerful than you. As one period observer of merchant life might have put it, dryly, it is a fine thing to be owed money by a prince, right up until the moment you actually need it back. Stack these 4 risks against each other and a pattern emerges. Plague and war are the risks everyone assumes define this trade, and they're real, but adulteration prosecutions and bad noble debt are the ones that could end a specific shop on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, with no war and no plague anywhere in sight. The dramatic risks make for a better story. The quiet ones ended more careers. No single complete apothecary ledger survives to hand you a clean full year of numbers, so what follows is a labeled reconstruction, built from comparable price and wage data of the period, not a transcription of any one surviving account book. Good year, strong wedding season demand, a stable ongoing pigment contract with a painter's workshop, no guild trouble, and no defaulted credit balances to absorb. Reconstructed net income here lands comfortably above 10 times a skilled laborer's annual wage, edging your household well into genuine mercantile prosperity, with real surplus left over for property or investment. Average year, steady local herbal trade, 1 or 2 luxury orders across the calendar, some modest credit extended and mostly repaid on schedule. Reconstructed net income sits somewhere around 5 to 7 times a skilled laborer's annual wage, a solid, comfortable, thoroughly respectable merchant-class living without the surplus of a truly good year. Bad year, a spice price spike triggered by a Genoa-Venice trade disruption, a defaulted credit balance from an overextended noble client, and a slow, thin winter trading season on top of it. Reconstructed net income here barely clears a skilled laborer's own annual wage once shop expenses and guild dues are subtracted, and in some genuinely bad years it dips into an outright loss that had to be covered out of savings, or worse, by taking on new debt of your own. Line these 3 years up side by side and the spread is the real story. A good year and a bad year, for the exact same shop, the exact same owner, and the exact same stock of jars behind the counter, could differ by a factor of 10 or more depending on how many of the higher revenue rungs were firing at once, and how many risk events landed in the same 12 months. This wasn't a stable trade with predictable margins. It was a high-variance trade that happened to look stable from the outside, because the shop sign never changed even when the fortune behind it swung wildly from one year to the next. Call him Messer Antonio, a composite built from patterns visible across several surviving Speziaria account fragments and guild records, not a single named individual, and I want to say that plainly, rather than dressing up an educated guess as a discovery. It's worth naming, too, that real apothecary-adjacent figures in this period did follow strikingly similar arcs, men who entered the Arte die Medici e Speziali as tradesmen, and left the historical record as property owners and minor office holders. Their shop ledgers a smaller and smaller fraction of a much larger fortune by the end of their lives. Antonio didn't get rich because he worked harder than his neighbors, up before dawn, grinding roots by candlelight. He got rich because he fundamentally restructured what his shop actually was. He treated the basic herbal trade as little more than a loss leader for foot traffic and reputation, built a standing pigment supply contract with a busy painter's workshop, positioned himself as the preferred saffron source for merchant-class weddings across his district, and used his own account book to extend credit to the same wealthy families over and over, quietly becoming something close to their personal financier. Within 2 decades, the medicine counter was a minor line item in his total income. Property, standing credit relationships, and a secure guild seat were the actual business. He didn't get rich selling medicine. He got rich by owning the infrastructure that sat around medicine, the credit, the standing supply contracts, and the guild seat that helped decide who else was even allowed to compete with him. That's the structural insight underneath every wealthy apothecary story that survives from this period, whether it's a specific documented name or a composite drawn from a dozen fading account books. The fortune was never in the mortar and pestle. It was in everything the shop quietly became once the mortar and pestle stopped being the point. You didn't open a medicine shop. You opened a licensing business, a luxury goods business, and a credit business that happened to sell medicine on the side. And in medieval Florence, the apothecaries who understood that distinction got rich, while the ones who genuinely believed they were healers, first and foremost, stayed comfortable at best, and far too often, stayed poor.